They said no man would ever want her. Not because she was cruel or unkind, but because the world had decided that a woman of her size didn't deserve to be loved. She'd heard it her entire life, whispered comments in church halls, the careful way people's eyes would slide away when she entered a room, the way mothers would pull their daughters closer as if her appearance was contagious. Margaret had learned to make herself useful instead of beautiful. She'd learned to work harder, smile softer, take up less space in conversations. She'd learned to be invisible in plain sight. But on a cold March morning in 1889, when desperation wore the face of a grieving man with hollow eyes and a child who hadn't smiled in months, everything Margaret thought she knew about her own worth would be challenged. Because sometimes the people who see us most clearly are the ones who have nothing left to lose. Sometimes survival teaches us what love should have taught us all along. This is the story of a woman who was told she was too much, and a man who discovered she was exactly enough. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The boarding house on Maple Street in Burlington, Vermont, was a respectable establishment run by a respectable woman named Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, which meant it operated on the strict principle that nothing unusual should ever happen within its walls. The guests were orderly, the meals were punctual, the help was reliable and forgettable, exactly as Mrs. Hartwell preferred. Margaret Chen had worked there for 7 years. She was now 34 years old. She arrived before dawn each morning, her key fitting silently into the kitchen door, and she left after the supper. Dishes were dried and put away, usually well past 8 in the evening. In between, she managed the cooking, the laundry, the mending, and the 1,000 invisible tasks that kept a boarding house functioning smoothly. She was excellent at her work. She was also, in Mrs. Hartwell's estimation, perfectly suited to being forgotten. This suited Margaret fine, or at least she'd convinced herself it did. The boarding house kitchen was her domain, a large room with a cast-iron stove that had personality and opinions, copper pots that hung in descending order of size, and a long wooden counter scarred by years of chopping and kneading and the daily work of feeding other people. Margaret knew every inch of it. She could navigate it in complete darkness, which was fortunate because the lamp Mrs. Hartwell provided was perpetually low on oil. On this particular morning in early March, Margaret had been up since 4 o'clock. As always, she'd built the fire in the stove, checked the pantry inventory, and was in the process of preparing the dough for the morning's bread when she heard the commotion from the front of the house. Mrs. Hartwell's voice, sharp and flustered. A man's voice, lower, controlled, but with an edge to it that suggested control was requiring effort. And beneath both, the sound of a child crying, not the healthy cry of hunger or tiredness, but something raw, something that sounded like grief. Margaret's hands stilled in the dough. In 7 years, she'd learned that Mrs. Hartwell maintained strict policies about disturbances. Guests were expected to be quiet. Families with small children were discouraged. The boarding house was for respectable single gentlemen and widows of means, not for the complications that children represented. The crying continued, then silence, then Mrs. Hartwell's voice again, sharper now, her tone taking on the quality of someone explaining something obvious to someone who was refusing to understand it. Margaret returned to her work, kneading the dough with more force than necessary. It wasn't her business. Nothing that happened in the front rooms of the boarding house was her business. She was the help. She cooked, she cleaned, she existed in the spaces between other people's lives, never quite part of them. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face flushed with the particular kind of irritation that came from having her orderly world disrupted. "We have a guest arriving today," she announced. "A Mr. Thomas Ashford. He'll be staying in the front room on the 2nd floor, the one with the good light. He's a widower. He has a daughter. She's 6 years old." Margaret glanced up from the bread, surprised. This was highly irregular. I trust you'll manage the extra laundry without complaint. Mrs. Hartwell continued, her tone suggesting that complaints would not be welcome regardless. Mr. Ashford has paid for 2 months in advance, and he's apparently desperate enough for housing to accept a child-friendly arrangement, so we'll make it work. The girl's name is Emma. She's quiet. Mostly. The way she said, mostly suggested that Emma had been considerably less quiet moments ago. I'll manage fine, Mrs. Hartwell, Margaret said, turning back to her work. When does he arrive? This afternoon. Probably around 2 o'clock. I've arranged for the girl to take her meals in the dining room with her father. I won't have her running through the halls disturbing the other guests, but I'll need you to prepare something she'll actually eat. Apparently, she's been difficult about food since her mother passed. Mr. Ashford is at his wits' end. Margaret nodded. She'd learned long ago not to waste words on Mrs. Hartwell. The woman didn't want conversation. She wanted confirmation that her instructions would be followed. After Mrs. Hartwell left, Margaret found herself thinking about the child. 6 years old, recently motherless, grieving to the point of tears in a boarding house full of strangers who probably viewed her as an inconvenience. She'd been thinking about children a lot lately, though she rarely admitted it to herself. At 34, with no prospects of marriage and no family of her own, children existed for Margaret mostly in the abstract. She saw them occasionally when families visited Burlington, always noting how their mothers or nannies would position themselves slightly in front of the larger woman, as if Margaret's mere presence might somehow taint them. There was a particular kind of loneliness in watching other people's children. Margaret prepared the bread, shaped it into loaves, and set them to rise. Then she began planning the evening meal, her mind working through what a grieving 6-year-old might actually eat. Not the hearty beef stew she was making for the other boarders. Something gentler, something that required less courage to swallow. By 2 o'clock, the bread was baked and cooling, the kitchen was clean, and Margaret was back at her work, preparing vegetables for the supper, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind remained partially elsewhere, wondering about the widower and his daughter. She heard their arrival distantly, the sound of a carriage, the heavy footsteps that suggested a man carrying luggage, Mrs. Hartwell's voice offering the standard boarding house welcome. But she remained in the kitchen, as she always did. The arrival of guests was not her domain. It was only when Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the kitchen doorway again, this time looking considerably more frazzled than before, that Margaret learned the complication. "The girl won't eat," Mrs. Hartwell said without preamble. Mr. Ashford brought her to the dining room, tried to get her to take some soup, and she simply refused. She's sitting at the table crying silently, which is somehow worse than the active crying from this morning, and Mr. Ashford looks like he might fall apart himself. "I've told him we'll provide what we can, but I can't have this disrupting the entire boarding house." Margaret set down her knife. "What does she like?" Mrs. Hartwell blinked. "I beg your pardon. What foods does the girl prefer? Has her father mentioned anything she'll eat?" He mentioned she used to like her mother's bread pudding, but Mrs. Hartwell caught herself, seeming to realize she was discussing the details of a guest's private life with the hired help. "In any case, I'm sure you have enough to manage without taking on personal cooking projects." But Margaret was already moving, her hands reaching for eggs, milk, butter, the bread she'd baked that morning. Bread pudding was simple. It was also, she'd learned over the years, deeply comforting. There was something about the combination of soft bread and warm custard that spoke to childhood, to being cared for, to a time when the world felt safer. "I can have it ready in an hour," Margaret said, not asking permission, simply stating fact. Mrs. Hartwell hesitated, then nodded with obvious relief at the prospect of the child problem being solved. She left Margaret to her work. An hour later, Margaret carried a small bowl of bread, pudding down from the kitchen, warm and fragrant with vanilla and cinnamon. She'd resisted the urge to make it special, no elaborate presentation. Just comfort in a bowl. The kind of thing a child wouldn't have to think about before eating, wouldn't have to approach as a test of bravery or willingness. She knocked softly on the dining room door. "Mrs." Hartwell answered, looking harried. "I prepared something that might help," Margaret said quietly, holding out the bowl. "Mrs." Hartwell took it with visible gratitude and started to close the door, but Margaret caught a glimpse of the dining room behind her. A man sat at the table, his head bowed, his shoulders carrying the kind of weight that suggested they'd been bearing it alone for too long. And beside him, a small girl with dark hair and swollen eyes, slumped in a chair like she'd run out of energy to hold herself up. Then the door closed, and Margaret returned to the kitchen. She didn't expect to hear what happened next, didn't expect Mrs. Hartwell to return 15 minutes later, looking for her, to report that the girl had eaten the entire bowl, that she'd actually eaten, that Mr. Ashford had looked at the dish with something like hope in his expression, hope that something, at least, might be manageable. He asked, "Who prepared it?" "Mrs. Hartwell said, with the tone of someone reporting an unusual occurrence. "I told him you did. He'd like to thank you himself, but I explained that would be irregular." Margaret nodded, accepting this as the natural order of things. She was the help. The guests didn't thank her. The guests didn't see her, not really. They ate her food and used her labor and existed in their own separate sphere, one that didn't intersect with hers. That should have been the end of it. A small kindness, quickly forgotten, returning to the normal rhythm of an invisible life. But it wasn't. The next morning, when Margaret came down to prepare breakfast, she found a note tucked beside the coffee pot. Her name was written on the envelope in careful, deliberate handwriting. Inside was a simple message: "Thank you for yesterday. Emma actually smiled this morning." T. Ashford, Margaret stood in her empty kitchen, holding the note, and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope, exactly. Hope seemed too ambitious for a woman of her years and circumstances, but perhaps acknowledgement, recognition, the smallest evidence that her work had been seen, had mattered, had made a difference. She tucked the note into her apron pocket and returned to her work, telling herself it meant nothing. A guest expressing gratitude, nothing more. But as she kneaded the dough for that morning's bread, her hands moved with slightly more purpose than usual. And when she planned the day's meals, she found herself considering not just nutrition and efficiency, but whether there was anything a grieving 6-year-old girl might find comforting in what she prepared. This too, she told herself, meant nothing. She was simply doing her job well. This was what she did. This was who she was, invisible, useful, alone. And that, she'd learned long ago, was exactly what a woman like her should expect from life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The note in Margaret's pocket became a small weight she carried for 3 days. She didn't show it to anyone. There was no one to show it to. Instead, she read it occasionally when she was alone in the kitchen, the words becoming more familiar each time. "Thank you for yesterday. Emma actually smiled this morning." By the 4th day, the note had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases were beginning to separate the paper. Margaret put it away in the small wooden box under her bed, where she kept the few personal items she owned: a photograph of her parents from when she was a child, a handkerchief her mother had embroidered, a dried flower from a garden she'd worked in years ago. Things that proved she'd existed before the boarding house, before invisibility became a way of life. Mr. Thomas Ashford and his daughter Emma had settled into a quiet routine in the front room on the 2nd floor. Margaret knew this because she was the one who cleaned their space, who changed their linens, who listened to the sounds of their lives through the floorboards and walls. She knew that Emma woke early with nightmares. She knew that Mr. Ashford would walk the halls with her at odd hours, his footsteps slow and patient. She knew that Emma refused most of what was served at the main dining table, but would eat what Margaret prepared in small, quiet portions. What Margaret didn't know was that Thomas Ashford had begun timing his trips downstairs to coincide with the hours when Margaret worked in the kitchen. It happened first by accident. 3 days after his arrival, he'd come down in the late afternoon looking for tea for Emma, who'd complained of a cough. Margaret was washing dishes, her back to the door, her hands deep in soapy water. She didn't realize he was there until he spoke. "Excuse me, I'm sorry to intrude. I was looking for hot water, if it's available." Margaret turned, startled, her wet hands dripping onto her apron. Thomas Ashford stood in the kitchen doorway, a place the boarding house guests never ventured. He was taller than she'd realized, with dark hair graying at the temples and eyes that looked like they'd seen more loss than any person should have to carry. He was dressed formally, a vest, a jacket despite being inside, as if maintaining appearance was one of the few things still within his control. "Of course," Margaret said quickly, moving to the stove. "I can prepare it right away. Should I send it to your room, or—" "No, I'll wait," he said. "If you don't mind. Emma's doing her letters in the turn parlor. I have a moment." Margaret had never had a boarding house guest wait for anything in the kitchen. It violated something fundamental about the hierarchy of the place. She busied herself with the kettle, aware of his presence in a way that made her skin feel too tight. "How long have you worked here?" he asked conversationally. 7 years, Margaret said. She poured hot water into a teapot, added tea leaves with practiced efficiency, trying to ignore the fact that he was watching her work. "And before that?" The question caught her off guard. No one ever asked Margaret about before. Before was irrelevant. Before was not the boarding house kitchen, and therefore before was not her story. "Various positions," she said finally. "Household staff, mostly." "You're very good at it," he said. "I don't just mean the cooking, though that's exceptional. I mean all of it. The way you move through the work, the way you know exactly what's needed before it's asked for. It's a skill." Margaret didn't know how to respond to a compliment. She'd received so few in her life that they felt like they might be somehow incorrect, like he was mistaking her for someone else, someone worthy of notice. The kettle whistled, and she was grateful for the excuse to look away from his gaze. "Thank you," she said quietly, preparing the tea. "I mean it," he continued, and there was something in his voice that suggested he understood her hesitation. "My wife, Emma's mother, she was like that. She had a way of making ordinary things feel like care. I think that's what you're doing, actually. Every meal you prepare for Emma, you're saying something she can taste. Something that means she's not forgotten, that she matters." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she set the teapot and a cup on a small tray. She didn't trust her voice, so she simply handed it to him. He took it but didn't leave immediately. "Emma asked about you yesterday. She wanted to know your name. I hadn't realized. She didn't know it until she asked." "I'm Margaret," she said. "Margaret Chen." "Thomas Ashford," he replied, as if they were being properly introduced for the first time, as if the formality of names mattered now, when it hadn't mattered on the day he'd arrived. "And this tea you've prepared, I think Emma will drink it because you made it. Not because of the tea itself, but because you made it." After he left, Margaret stood alone in the kitchen and tried to understand what had just happened. A guest had treated her like a person, had asked her questions about her life, had noticed her work and called it a skill, had used the words care and mattered in the same sentence as her name. It felt dangerous somehow, like acknowledging that she was more than invisible might somehow jinx the fragile peace she'd built in not expecting anything from anyone. But over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Thomas would find reasons to come to the kitchen. Sometimes it was for tea. Sometimes it was to ask advice about what Emma might eat. Sometimes it was simply to be present while Margaret worked, reading a newspaper in the corner or working through correspondence, his presence becoming as familiar as the sounds of the stove. He began to talk about his wife, Catherine, who had died of pneumonia 2 years ago, about the way Emma had stopped speaking for 6 months afterward, about the house they'd had to leave in Boston because it held too many reminders, too many empty rooms where Catherine should have been. about the desperate search for somewhere that might feel new, somewhere that might allow them to grieve without drowning. "We've lived in 3 different boarding houses in the past year," he said one afternoon, watching Margaret prepare soup. Emma would seem to adjust, and then something would trigger the memory, and we'd be back to the crying, the silence, the feeling that the world had stopped and everyone else hadn't noticed. Margaret listened while she worked. She'd learned that he didn't seem to expect responses, that the talking was itself a kind of relief. She also learned not to offer pity. Thomas Ashford didn't want pity. He wanted to be heard by someone who wouldn't immediately offer platitudes or try to fix what couldn't be fixed. "Mrs. Hartwell mentioned you've been here 7 years, he said one day. "That's a long time to stay in one place. Have you been happy here?" The question was so direct that Margaret set down her knife and looked at him. No one had ever asked her if she was happy. Happy seemed like the province of other women, women who were loved, women whose appearance didn't determine their worth, women who had choices. "I've been content," she said carefully. "This work is stable. Mrs. Hartwell is fair." "That's not the same as happy," Thomas observed. "No," Margaret admitted. "It's not." "What would make you happy?" he asked, and something in his expression suggested he genuinely wanted to know. Margaret turned back to her work. "I'm not sure that's a question I'm equipped to answer. I've spent a long time not asking myself questions like that." "Then perhaps it's time to start," Thomas said quietly. That evening, after the guests had been served and the dining room was cleared, Margaret sat on the stool in the kitchen with a cup of tea she'd made just for herself, a luxury she rarely indulged in, and tried to consider the question seriously. What would make her happy? The obvious answers came first: financial security, the ability to live without worry about where her next meal would come from, the respect of people who looked at her and saw a person rather than a problem to be managed. But beneath those practical concerns, there was something else. Something that Thomas's presence in the kitchen had awakened, a desire to be known, to matter to someone, to have her work recognized not just as competence but as care, to be chosen, not because she was useful, but because someone wanted her, to stay. These were dangerous thoughts. Margaret knew that. She'd seen other women make themselves small around such thoughts, had watched them accept half measures and false promises because the alternative, hoping for real connection, was too painful when it inevitably didn't materialize. A woman of her size, her age, her circumstances, didn't get to have those kinds of hopes. That was simply the truth of the world as it was organized, and yet Thomas Ashford kept coming to the kitchen. He kept asking her questions. He kept treating her like her thoughts and opinions mattered. He kept making it very difficult for Margaret to maintain the distance she'd worked so hard to build. The crisis came on a Thursday in early April, nearly a month after Thomas and Emma had arrived at the boarding house. Emma had been sick, nothing serious, just a spring cold, and Margaret had been sending up warm broth and gentle foods to help her recover. Emma had improved quickly, as children do, bouncing back with the resilience of youth. On Thursday afternoon, she came downstairs with her father for the first time in several days, looking pale but determined. Mrs. Hartwell, watching Emma navigate the dining room with obvious concern, pulled Margaret aside after the meal. "The girl will need to return to her room," she said bluntly. "I've been generous, allowing a child to stay here as long as I have, but I have other guests to consider. A boarding house is no place for a grieving family. It's no place for children at all, really. Mr. Ashford needs to find other arrangements." Margaret's stomach dropped. "But she's only just recovered. A few more days of rest, and a few more days will become a few more weeks," Mrs. Hartwell interrupted. "I'm not running a charity, Margaret. I'm running a respectable boarding house. This situation is becoming complicated. I expect you to understand that." After Mrs. Hartwell left, Margaret stood in the kitchen, unable to move. The thought of Thomas and Emma leaving was like the thought of a sudden absence, a kind of small death. She'd grown accustomed to the sound of Thomas's footsteps. She'd grown accustomed to preparing meals, knowing Emma would eat them. She'd grown accustomed to mattering, however quietly, to someone. That evening, when Thomas came down to say goodnight to the kitchen, a ritual he'd developed, Margaret told him what Mrs. Hartwell had said. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, a kind of resignation settling over his features. "I suppose I should have expected it. No one really wants a widower, and his traumatized daughter cluttering up their orderly world." "You could find another boarding house," Margaret said, but even as she said it, she knew how that sentence would end. Another boarding house where he and Emma would be tolerated for a time before being asked to leave again. Another temporary arrangement in a series of temporary arrangements that had characterized the past year of their lives. "I could," Thomas agreed, "or I could do what I should probably have done weeks ago." He looked at her directly, and Margaret felt her breath catch. "Margaret, I know this is forward, and I know I'm asking something that might seem impossible, but you've done something for Emma, for both of us, that no one else has managed. You've made us feel like we belong somewhere. You've made Emma feel safe enough to smile again. And I find myself in a position where I need to ask if you would consider." He paused, searching for words. "What if you didn't have to stay here? What if you came with us? Not as a servant, though I understand you might need work, but as someone who matters, as someone who stays because she chooses to, not because she's hired to." Margaret stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. "Mr. Ashford, I know what people say about women like you," he continued quietly. "I've seen the way people look when you pass. I've heard the whispers, and I've never understood it, because what I see is a woman of remarkable capability and kindness. What I see is someone who deserves to be valued. Emma sees it too. She told me yesterday that you were beautiful because your hands know how to make people feel better." Margaret felt tears pressing against her eyes. She blinked them back forcefully. "You don't have to say things like that." "I'm not saying it to be kind," Thomas replied. "I'm saying it because it's true. Stay with us, Margaret. Not because you have to, because you want to." For the first time in 7 years of invisibility, Margaret Chen was seen. And the terrifying, wonderful, impossible part was that it felt exactly like coming home. Margaret didn't answer Thomas immediately. She couldn't. The words he'd spoken had opened a door in her mind that she'd deliberately kept locked for decades, and the rush of possibility and fear that poured through was almost paralyzing. She stood in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, trying to find solid ground in a moment that felt like everything was shifting. "I need to think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, respecting her need for space in a way that somehow made the offer feel more real, more genuine. "Of course. But understand that this isn't a casual invitation, Margaret. I'm asking because I mean it. Emma asked me this morning if you would always be here. When I told her I didn't know, she cried. That child has barely cried since her mother died. She's been too numb, too lost. But she cried about the possibility of you leaving." He left the kitchen then, understanding that continuing would only complicate what was already impossibly complicated. Margaret was left alone with the weight of what had been offered and the terror of what accepting it would mean. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small room above the kitchen, listening to the boarding house settle into silence, and tried to imagine a life that wasn't this one. It was harder than it should have been. 7 years of staying in one place, of following the same routine, of expecting nothing, had calcified into something that felt like identity. The idea of disrupting it felt less like possibility and more like falling. By morning, Margaret had convinced herself that she'd misunderstood, that Thomas had been grateful, caught in a moment of emotion, and that upon reflection the proposal would seem as impractical to him as it did to her. A woman of her size, her age, her lack of formal training, what could she possibly offer a widower and his daughter beyond cooking and cleaning? And why would he want that when he could hire any number of younger women, prettier women, women who wouldn't raise eyebrows simply by existing in his home? She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, preparing the most elaborate breakfast she could manage, cleaning the kitchen until it gleamed, trying to exhaust herself into acceptance of the life she'd been living. It didn't work. The awareness that things could be different now sat in her chest like a stone, immovable and heavy. It was Emma who broke the silence. Margaret was preparing lunch when Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, a rare occurrence. The child rarely ventured into the service spaces of the boarding house, preferring to remain in her room or the parlor where her father kept her company. She stood uncertainly in the doorway, as if not quite sure she was allowed to be there, wearing a pale blue dress that hung loosely on her thin frame. "Hello, Emma," Margaret said, setting down her knife. "Does your father know you're down here?" Emma shook her head. She held something in her hands, a piece of paper, folded several times. "I wrote something," she said quietly. "Daddy said I could show you, but only if I wanted to." Margaret's hands were wet from washing vegetables. She dried them carefully on her apron, suddenly aware of how large her hands looked, how the disparity between her size and Emma's small fragility seemed even more pronounced in the close space of the kitchen. "May I see it?" Margaret asked gently. Emma stepped forward and held out the paper. Her handwriting was careful, painstaking, the product of someone recently learning to form letters properly. The message was short but forcefully written. "Please don't go away. You make Daddy smile again. You make me not scared. Please stay with us." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. She looked at Emma's face, at the desperate hope there, at the vulnerability of a 6-year-old who'd already lost too much and was trying so hard to hold on to something good. "Oh, Emma," Margaret said. And then she did something she'd never done with a guest before. She knelt down to the child's level, despite the awkwardness of her body, despite knowing how ridiculous she probably looked. "Sweetheart, where did this idea come from? Daddy said maybe you might leave because Mrs. Hartwell is mean," Emma said with the blunt honesty of childhood. "He said you were thinking about it. He said if you stayed with us, you wouldn't have to work for Mrs. Hartwell anymore. You could be our friend, and I could learn to make bread like you make bread, and we could all be together and nobody would have to be alone anymore." The child's logic was heartbreaking in its simplicity. From Emma's perspective, the solution was obvious. The woman who made her feel safe, who had brought her back from the edge of grief with bread pudding and gentle hands, simply needed to stop being somewhere else and start being with them. "That's very sweet," Margaret said carefully, "but it's more complicated than that." "Why?" Emma asked. "Daddy has a house. You don't have a house. You could have a house. Daddy said you could." Margaret sat back on her heels, overwhelmed. Thomas had apparently done more than make an offer in a moment of emotional vulnerability. He'd discussed it with his daughter. He'd apparently been planning this, had been preparing Emma for the possibility that Margaret might say yes. "Where is your father now?" Margaret asked. "In the parlor," Emma said. "Reading. He said I could come talk to you, because sometimes girls understand things that fathers don't understand as good." Margaret stood a process that required some effort and took Emma's hand. Together, they walked to the parlor where Thomas was indeed reading, though Margaret suspected he'd been watching the doorway, waiting to see if Emma would complete this small mission. He looked up when they entered, and something in his expression shifted when he saw Margaret's face. "Emma showed me her letter," Margaret said, "and she told me that you've discussed this with her, that you've made plans." Thomas set down his book carefully. "I wanted Emma to understand that this wasn't something I was proposing on a whim. I wanted her to know that there could be a future where we didn't have to be constantly moving, constantly uncertain, where we had stability and care and someone who actually wanted to be part of our lives rather than tolerating us." "You shouldn't have included her in this before I'd made a decision," Margaret said, but her tone wasn't angry. It was something closer to heartbroken. "It's not fair to her to build hope on something that might not happen." "I know," Thomas agreed. "You're right. I apologize. But Margaret, I need you to understand something. He glanced at Emma, then back to Margaret. "I'm not offering you a position out of desperation or gratitude. Yes, I'm grateful Emma is alive in a way she hasn't been since her mother died, and I have you to thank for that. But that's not why I'm asking. I'm asking because I believe that everyone deserves to have a choice about how they live their life, and I'm hoping you'll choose us." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her again. She looked at Emma, whose small face was anxious, hopeful, desperate. She thought about Mrs. Hartwell, about the years of invisibility, about the small room above the kitchen that would never be anything more than a place to sleep. She thought about the note that had been folded and refolded 100 times. "Thank you for yesterday." Emma actually smiled this morning. "Tell me about your house," Margaret said slowly. "The one you mentioned. The one you're going back to or going to. I need to understand what you're actually asking me to be part of." Thomas's expression shifted, becoming more hopeful. "It's in Montpelier. Nothing fancy, a Victorian with 7 rooms, a good kitchen, a garden that needs work. I inherited it from my mother 2 years ago. I've been renting it out, but the tenants are leaving in June. I've been thinking I should go back, that staying in transit was doing Emma more harm than good. But I didn't want to go back alone, and I didn't want Emma to feel like we were returning to a place full of memories of her mother. I wanted the house to feel new somehow. Different. Different how?" Margaret asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "With you in it," Thomas said simply. "Making it a home again instead of just a building where we exist." Margaret sat down slowly on the chair beside them. Emma immediately climbed into her lap, something Margaret would never have expected to happen, something that made her entire body feel suddenly too full of emotion to contain. The child was light and warm and trusting, and the weight of that trust was the most precious and terrifying thing Margaret had ever held. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said, her voice shaking slightly. "About why I came to work at the boarding house. About who I am beneath this." Over the next hour, Margaret told them her story. About growing up with parents who'd loved her but struggled with the reality of having a daughter who didn't fit the standards of beauty the world had established. About the ways she'd learned early to make herself useful to compensate for the perceived flaw of her body. About the series of positions she'd held in other households, each one ending when the family decided she was no longer needed or wanted. About the boarding house, which had offered stability but at the price of invisibility. She told them about the men who'd looked at her with revulsion, the women who'd acted as though her size was somehow contagious, the countless small humiliations that had accumulated into a conviction that she would always be alone. She told them about the comfort she'd found in work, in being needed, in the knowledge that at least her labor had value, even if she didn't. Thomas listened without interrupting. Emma, not fully understanding all the complexity, simply held onto Margaret's hand and occasionally squeezed it, as if offering reassurance. When Margaret finished, Thomas spoke carefully. "I won't pretend that the world is fair or that people won't judge you. They will. But Margaret, I need you to hear this. In my house, the only judgment that matters is mine and Emma's. And I see a woman of extraordinary strength and capability. Emma sees someone who makes her feel safe. We both see someone we want in our lives. People will talk," Margaret warned. "A single man living with a woman. Then we'll marry," Thomas interrupted, and Margaret's breath caught. "If you'll have me, I'm not asking you to marry me today, or even this month. I'm asking you to come to Montpelier, to give us a chance to know each other better in a situation where you're not serving us. You're partnering with us. And if, over time, we find that we can build something real together, then we'll do that. But regardless, you won't be alone anymore. Neither will Emma. That's my promise." Margaret looked at this man who'd appeared in the boarding house kitchen a month ago with a grief-stricken daughter and had somehow seen in her something worth asking for. She thought about the note in the wooden box under her bed. She thought about 7 years of invisibility ending, possibly, with this moment of being truly seen. "When would you want an answer?" she asked. "By tomorrow," Thomas said. Mrs. Hartwell has agreed to allow us to stay through the end of the month while I make arrangements for the move. After that, whether you come with us or stay here, we need to move forward." Margaret nodded slowly. She looked at Emma's face, at the desperate hope there. She thought about the question that had haunted her. What would make her happy? And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe that an answer might actually exist. Margaret didn't sleep that night either, but this time it wasn't from anxiety. It was from the electric hum of possibility, the sensation of standing at a crossroads and understanding that whichever path she chose would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her life. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried to imagine what accepting would actually mean. Not just moving to a new house, not just leaving the boarding house behind, but accepting that she could be more than invisible, that she could be chosen, that her life could contain more than duty and work and the quiet satisfaction of being needed. It terrified her. By morning, Margaret had made a list in her mind of all the reasons she should say no. The list was long and organized and absolutely logical. She was 34 years old, set in her ways, accustomed to a life of service. Thomas had known her for barely a month. Emma was a child, grieving, vulnerable. What if Margaret disappointed her? What if she failed them? What if accepting this offer meant opening herself to the kind of rejection that would be even more devastating than the quiet rejections she'd endured over the years? She prepared breakfast mechanically, moving through the familiar motions, while her mind spiraled through contingencies and catastrophes. She was so lost in her thoughts that she almost didn't notice Mrs. Hartwell appearing in the kitchen doorway, her expression unusually stern. "Mr. Ashford has informed me that he'll be leaving at the end of the month, Mrs." Hartwell said without preamble. "He's taken a house in Montpelier. I wanted to give you notice that his departure will mean a reduction in your workload. I won't be requiring a full-time cook once he's gone. I'll be reducing your position to 4 days a week, with a corresponding reduction in pay." Margaret's hands stilled in the act of stirring eggs. "I see. I suggest you look for additional work elsewhere." Mrs. Hartwell continued with the tone of someone delivering practical advice rather than bad news. "Your cooking is adequate, and your reliability is appreciated, but I can't justify full wages for partial work. You'll need to find supplementary employment or accept a significant reduction in your circumstances." After Mrs. Hartwell left, Margaret stood alone in the kitchen and felt something shift inside her. The list of reasons to say no had just been reorganized. Suddenly, rejecting Thomas's offer didn't mean preserving the status quo. It meant accepting a slow decline into financial precarity, watching her already meager wages shrink, spending her later years growing increasingly desperate as age made it harder to find work at all. She'd thought she was choosing between safety and risk. She realized now that safety had been an illusion. The boarding house had only ever been a temporary shelter, not the stable future she'd convinced herself it represented. By midday, Margaret had made her decision, not because she was certain it was right, but because she understood that the alternative was no longer available to her. She found Thomas in the parlor with Emma, working on arithmetic lessons. Emma looked up hopefully when Margaret entered, as if she'd been waiting for this conversation all morning. "I'll come with you," Margaret said simply. "To Montpelier, to your house. I'll give it a try." Emma's face transformed, joy breaking across it like sunlight. She jumped up from her chair and wrapped her small arms around Margaret as far as they would reach. Thomas stood more slowly, his expression cautious, as if he was afraid that one wrong move might cause Margaret to reconsider. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You won't regret this." "I might," Margaret replied, trying to be honest even in this moment of acceptance. "But I'm willing to find out." The following week passed, in a strange haze of preparation and finality. Margaret gave Mrs. Hartwell formal notice, collected her small amount of personal belongings, and began the process of saying goodbye to the only stable life she'd known in 7 years. It was harder than she'd anticipated, not because she'd loved the boarding house, but because leaving meant acknowledging that the life she'd built here was ending, and whatever came next was still entirely unknown. She worked her final full week with quiet dedication, preparing the meals Mrs. Hartwell and the other guests had come to expect, making no announcement of her departure, requiring no fanfare or acknowledgement. She'd learned long ago that invisibility worked both ways. People forgot you with the same ease that they'd overlooked you while you were present. What surprised her was that Thomas and Emma noticed each small service, each meal carefully prepared, each task completed with extra attention. Thomas would come to the kitchen and watch her work, and Margaret realized that in his attention she was learning to see herself differently, not as an invisible service provider, but as a person whose work had weight and meaning. On her final evening at the boarding house, after the dining room was cleared and the other guests had retired, Thomas and Emma came to the kitchen. Emma carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "We wanted to give you something," Emma said, her eyes bright with excitement. "Before we leave." Margaret dried her hands on her apron and opened the package carefully. Inside was a journal, leather-bound and beautiful, and a set of pencils. The first page contained a note in Emma's painstaking handwriting, "For you to write down happy things that happen." Margaret felt tears threaten and forced them back. "This is too generous," she said. "It's not generosity," Thomas corrected gently. "It's an investment in your future. Emma and I have been talking about what your life should look like in Montpelier, and we thought you should document it, so that someday, when you're old like Emma's grandmother, you'll have proof that this time existed, that we were here together." The weight of that simple act, giving her permission to document her own life, as if it mattered, hit Margaret with surprising force. She'd spent decades making herself invisible, accepting the assumption that her existence was primarily significant in how it served others. Now, she was being told that her experiences, her observations, her presence in the world had independent value. The journey to Montpelier took 2 days by carriage. The route wound north through Vermont's rolling hills, gradually becoming more mountainous as they approached the capital city, nestled in the central part of the state. Margaret sat beside Thomas on the carriage bench, while Emma dozed between them, worn out from the excitement of travel. "Are you frightened?" Thomas asked quietly, not looking away from the road. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "I've never lived anywhere but the boarding house, and before that, various houses where I worked. I don't know how to be anything but a servant in someone else's home." "Then we'll learn together," Thomas said. "This house isn't someone else's home, Margaret. It's going to be ours, all 3 of us. That changes what living in it means." The Victorian house in Montpelier was larger than Margaret had expected, painted a soft grey with white trim, surrounded by overgrown gardens and tall trees that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dappled shadows. It had a wide porch with columns, multiple stories, and chimneys at regular intervals, suggesting numerous fireplaces. It was, Margaret thought, the kind of house that required care and intention to become truly habitable. Inside, it was evident that the house had been neglected. The air smelled stale. Dust covered the furniture. The kitchen was outdated and cluttered with the detritus of previous tenants. But there was good bone structure to the place, and Margaret could see, beneath the neglect, the potential for something beautiful. "It's yours to do with as you see fit," Thomas said, watching her examine the space with a critical eye. "I'll hire help with the heavy work, but the kitchen is yours to organize however you want. And the rest of the house we'll decide together how to make it feel like home." That first night, Margaret lay in a real bed in a room of her own. Not a servant's quarters, but an actual bedroom with a window overlooking the garden, and felt the strangeness of having space, real space, for the first time in her adult life. The room was larger than her entire room at the boarding house. She could move without bumping into furniture. She could see out the window without standing on tiptoes. She thought about the journal Emma had given her and found a pencil in her bag. By lamplight, she wrote, "First night in Montpelier. The house feels large and full of possibility. I can hear Thomas moving in the room down the hall, checking on Emma. I can hear Emma breathing, deeper now that she's not afraid. The sound of sleeping people who have asked me to stay. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I know I'm exactly where I need to be. Over the following weeks, Margaret began the work of transforming the house. She cleaned systematically, moving through each room with the efficiency born of years of practice. She reorganized the kitchen, scrubbing it down to bare wood, and then reassembling it according to her own logic and needs. She opened windows to let in fresh air, removed heavy curtains that blocked light, and began the slow process of making the house feel inhabited. Thomas hired a local woman named Ruth to help with the heaviest cleaning, and together, Margaret and Ruth worked through the summer, gradually revealing the bones of what had been a beautiful home. Ruth was probably in her 50s, a widow with grown children, and she took one look at Margaret on the first day of work and seemed to immediately understand the situation without requiring explanation. "So you're the one who captured the widower's attention," Ruth said, not unkindly, as they began attacking the parlor. "Everyone in town's been talking about Mr. Ashford having a lady companion. There's been a lot of speculation about what that means." "It means I'm helping care for his daughter and his home," Margaret said carefully. Ruth snorted. "It means you're setting yourself up for either the best thing that ever happened to you or considerable scandal. There's no middle ground with situations like this." She glanced at Margaret with unexpected warmth. "But I'll tell you what I think. I think you look like someone who needed looking after, and I think that little girl looks like she's learning to smile again. Whatever people say, that's worth something." As summer progressed into early fall, patterns emerged. Margaret would wake before dawn to prepare breakfast. Emma would appear in the kitchen, increasingly comfortable, asking questions about cooking and helping with small tasks. Thomas would join them once breakfast was nearly ready, and they would eat together as a family, a concept Margaret was still getting accustomed to. The afternoons were Margaret's to spend, as she wished a freedom she'd never experienced. Sometimes she would work in the garden, pulling weeds and planning what vegetables to plant the following spring. Sometimes she would sit in the parlor and read, while Emma did her lessons nearby. Sometimes Thomas would ask her opinion on household decisions, and she would realize, startled, that her opinion actually mattered to him. In the evenings, they would gather in the parlor. Thomas would read aloud from novels or poetry. Emma would do needlework under Margaret's guidance, learning the same careful stitches Margaret's mother had taught her decades ago. Margaret would work on mending or other tasks, but increasingly, she found herself simply present, not working, just existing in the company of people who'd asked her to stay. One evening in September, as they sat together in the gathering darkness, Thomas set down his book and looked at Margaret directly. "I need to ask you something," he said, and something in his tone made Margaret's heart accelerate. "How are you feeling? About us? About this arrangement?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I'm feeling like I might be the luckiest woman alive," she said finally, "which terrifies me because good things haven't typically stayed in my life." "They're going to this time," Thomas said with quiet certainty, "because I'm going to make sure of it." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. It was the first deliberate physical contact, beyond the casual touches, that had become normal between them. Emma looked up from her needlework, watching with the intuition children seem to possess about important moments. "Margaret," Thomas continued, "I know it's only been a few months. I know this is fast, but I need you to know that I don't want you to ever feel like you're here on temporary terms. I want you to stay, not as an employee or a caregiver, as my wife, as Emma's mother, if you're willing." Margaret's breath caught. This was the moment she'd simultaneously been anticipating and dreading since the day she'd agreed to come to Montpelier. The moment when the arrangement became real, when it transformed from temporary necessity into permanent commitment. "People will talk," she said, echoing her earlier concern. "Let them," Thomas replied. "I stopped caring about other people's opinions the moment I realized that the person I wanted by my side was you." Emma, understanding enough to know this was a significant moment, squeezed Margaret's hand. "Yes," Margaret said, the word coming out smaller than she'd intended. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll be Emma's mother. I'll be your wife." Thomas smiled, a real smile. And for the first time since Margaret had met him, the exhaustion and grief that had defined his expression seemed to lift, replaced by something that looked like hope. "Then we'll be married," he said simply. Quietly, without fanfare. Just us and the people we've come to care about. Because this isn't about what the world thinks. It's about the three of us becoming a family in every sense that matters. The announcement of the wedding created exactly the kind of disruption Margaret had feared. Word spread through Montpelier's society with the efficiency of wildfire, and within days, the narrative had solidified into something Margaret barely recognized. A wealthy widower marrying his hired help, a woman of questionable character securing financial stability through manipulation, a child being subjected to the influence of someone unsuitable. The story people told themselves was one of scandal and impropriety, not love and partnership. Margaret first became aware of the scope of public opinion when Ruth arrived for work one morning with her jaw set tight and her eyes bright with barely contained anger. "There's been talk at the market," Ruth said without preamble, setting down her bag with more force than necessary. "Ugly talk. Women saying you trapped Mr. Ashford, that you seduced him to get out of your servant's position, that the child's being corrupted by association with you." One of the minister's wives said, "Your very presence in a respectable home is an affront to Christian values." Margaret felt her stomach clench. She'd known this was coming. She wasn't naive enough to believe that society would simply accept a relationship like theirs without question. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally were entirely different things. "What did you say?" Margaret asked quietly. "I told them all to go to hell," Ruth said bluntly. "But that's not going to stop them talking, and it's definitely not going to stop them trying to cause trouble. You need to be prepared for that." Thomas found Margaret in the garden later that afternoon, where she'd retreated to escape the weight of Ruth's warnings. He wheeled himself through the garden gate he'd taken to moving around the property more freely since arriving in Montpelier, and positioned himself beside the bench where Margaret sat. "Ruth told you?" he said. "It wasn't a question." "She did." "The things they're saying," Margaret started, but Thomas interrupted, "are the things people always say about women who don't fit their prescribed roles," he finished. "I won't pretend it doesn't matter. It does. But Margaret, I need you to understand something. The opinion of women at the market doesn't change what's true about us. It doesn't change that Emma is thriving. It doesn't change that I love you, or that this house is happier than it's been in years." "But what about Emma?" Margaret asked, the concern that had kept her awake most of the previous night finally spilling out. "If children at school are hearing these things, if they're treating her differently because of me, then we'll handle it," Thomas said firmly. "Together, the same way we handle everything else." The first real test came 2 weeks later. Emma returned from school with red-rimmed eyes and a bruise forming on her arm. She wouldn't explain what had happened at first, just retreated to her room and refused supper. It was Margaret who finally coaxed the story out of her, sitting on the edge of Emma's bed, asking gentle questions until the child broke. "Catherine Hutchins said, 'You're not really my mother,'" Emma said, her voice small and hurt. "She said, 'You're just someone Daddy hired because you're fat and no one else would want you.' She said, 'I should be ashamed of having you instead of my real mother.'" Emma's voice cracked. "And when I told her to stop, she pushed me into the wall." Margaret felt a flash of rage so intense it was almost blinding. Not at Emma, obviously. At Catherine Hutchins, at the child's parents, who'd clearly filled her head with the gossip they'd heard. At the entire structure of society that taught children to weaponize the insecurities of others. She took a breath, then another, trying to find the right words. "Catherine Hutchins said something that was both untrue and unkind," Margaret said carefully. "But I need you to know something important. I'm not your mother because of how I look or because your father hired me. I'm your mother because I choose to be." Every single day, I choose you. I choose to care for you, to help you grow, to make sure you feel loved and safe. That's what makes someone a mother, the choosing, not the blood. But she was right about one thing, Emma said quietly. I heard Mrs. Hutchins telling her husband that you're fat. Is that bad? Margaret chose her words with care. It's an observation about my body, which is different from a statement about my value as a person. I don't look like the women in fashion magazines, and I never will. But I'm strong enough to carry you when you're tired. I'm able to work in the garden for hours. My body does what I need it to do. That's not bad, that's just what I am. I don't think you're fat, Emma said with the blunt honesty of childhood. I think you're warm and you smell like cinnamon and you make the best bread. That's what I notice about you. Margaret pulled the child close, fighting back tears. Then we'll focus on what we know to be true and let other people worry about their own opinions. But the incident with Catherine Hutchins wasn't isolated. Over the following weeks, Margaret began to notice small cruelties. Shopkeepers who served her last and with visible reluctance, women who would cross the street to avoid walking near her, invitations that arrived addressed to Thomas and Emma but conspicuously didn't include Margaret. The subtle and not-so-subtle messaging that she was tolerated but not welcome, accepted only because Thomas had enough money and standing to make refusing him impossible. What Margaret hadn't anticipated was how Thomas would respond. One evening in late September, he called a gathering. Not large, just the people they'd come to know and trust in Montpelier. Ruth and her adult son, the local doctor who'd treated Emma for a minor ailment, the owner of the bookstore where Thomas had begun spending his afternoons, a few others. They gathered in the parlor on an October evening, confused about the purpose of the summons. I've asked you here, Thomas began, because I want to make a formal announcement, and I want it heard from people who matter to me, so that there's no misunderstanding about what's true. He turned to Margaret, who was sitting rigidly in her chair, uncertain what was about to happen. Margaret Chen and I are to be married, he said clearly. The ceremony will take place in 2 weeks, at the house, with just Emma and a few close friends present. But before that happens, I want everyone in this room to know exactly who Margaret is and why I'm choosing to spend my life with her. What followed was Thomas's testimony, not about Margaret's beauty or youth or any of the things society typically valued in women. Instead, he spoke about her strength, not just physical, but moral, about the way she'd transformed his home and his daughter's life, about the intelligence in her eyes and the kindness in her hands, about the way she'd asked for nothing and given everything, and how that act of selflessness had revealed to him what actual worth looked like. There will be people, he continued, who will say that this marriage is scandalous or inappropriate or the result of some kind of manipulation on Margaret's part. Those people are wrong. They're wrong because they've allowed society's narrow definitions of beauty and worth to blind them to the reality of who Margaret actually is. I'm asking all of you to be witnesses to the truth of this marriage and to stand against anyone who tries to diminish it. Ruth stood first, followed quickly by the others. They each offered words of support, of recognition, of willingness to defend the marriage against the whispers and judgments that would inevitably come. It was a small act, but it felt revolutionary to Margaret. These people with standing in the community, were publicly choosing to align themselves with her, to declare that her worth was real and worthy of respect. When the gathering ended, Margaret found herself shaking, overwhelmed by the experience of being publicly championed. Thomas found her in the kitchen, where she'd retreated to collect herself. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "I know," Thomas replied, "but it needed to be done. Not for us, we know what's true, but for Emma, and for everyone else who's been taught to believe the lies society tells about people like you. Someone needed to say it plainly. You matter. You're worthy of respect, and anyone who thinks otherwise is simply wrong." The wedding itself was small and quiet, exactly as Thomas had promised. They were married on a Saturday afternoon in the parlor of the house, with Reverend Morrison from the local church presiding. Emma stood beside Margaret as a kind of attendant, holding a small bouquet of autumn flowers. Ruth sat in the front, along with Thomas's business partner and a handful of others who'd become genuine friends rather than mere acquaintances. Margaret wore a dress she'd made herself a deep blue wool with subtle embroidery along the neckline that Emma had helped her plan. It wasn't the elaborate confection that society brides were expected to wear, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and it fit her properly, which was all that mattered. When Reverend Morrison asked if Margaret took Thomas to be her husband, she said yes, without hesitation. When he asked if Thomas took Margaret to be his wife, Thomas's voice was steady and certain. "I do. Absolutely, and without reservation." Emma squealed with delight when they exchanged the simple gold bands that Thomas had commissioned from a jeweler in town. The band was thick and well-made, the kind of ring designed for a lifetime of work, designed for hands that didn't need delicate ornamentation to prove their value. After the ceremony, they gathered for a modest supper in the dining room. Ruth had helped Margaret prepare it the day before: roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, bread that Margaret had baked that morning. It was the kind of meal that tasted like celebration without being ostentatious about it. As they ate, Thomas reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "Hundreds," Margaret replied honestly, "but none about marrying you." Emma giggled from her seat beside them. "That's a funny way to say you love him." "That is funny, isn't it?" Margaret said, squeezing back. "But it's also true." That night, after Emma had been put to bed, Thomas and Margaret stood together on the back porch of the house, looking out at the garden they'd begun to cultivate together. The October air was cool, carrying the scent of approaching winter. "Tomorrow," Thomas said, "people are still going to judge you. Women are still going to whisper. Life isn't going to become suddenly perfect just because we're married." "I know," Margaret said. "But tonight," he continued, "tonight you're my wife, Emma's mother, part of a family that chose you, that sees you, that values you for exactly who you are." Margaret leaned against him, feeling the solidity of him beside her, the reality of this life that had seemed so impossible just months ago. In the boarding house kitchen, she'd learned to be invisible. In this house, with this man and this child, she was learning to be seen. The two versions of herself couldn't have been more different, and yet they were the same person. The same hands that had prepared bread for desperate people, now preparing bread for family. "I was so afraid," Margaret admitted, "that this would all disappear, that I'd wake up and it would be the dream, and I'd be back in that kitchen, working for a woman who looked through me." "You're not going back," Thomas said with absolute certainty. "This is your life now, our life, and while it won't always be easy, it will always be real." In the distance, the Vermont hills rose against the darkening sky, solid and permanent. Margaret thought about roots, about the way trees push deep into the earth to anchor themselves. She'd spent so long trying to be easy to uproot, easy to dismiss, easy to leave behind. Now, finally, she was beginning to understand what it meant to grow deep, to become unmovable, to belong so completely to a place and to people that the thought of leaving felt like an amputation. She was home. After a lifetime of impermanence and invisibility, Margaret Chen Ashford had finally found home. Winter came to Vermont with sudden intensity, transforming the landscape into something crystalline and harsh. The garden that Margaret had spent the fall cultivating froze solid. Snow piled high against the windows. The world outside contracted to bare essentials, and the world inside the Ashford house became more defined, more intimate, more real. It was in this context of winter's enforced closeness that Margaret began to understand what she'd actually chosen when she agreed to become Thomas's wife. Not just a change in circumstances, though, that had occurred, not just a shift in social standing, though that mattered too, but a fundamental reorganization of how she understood herself and her place in the world. The house required constant attention. The heating system was temperamental. The pipes froze regularly. The kitchen, which had been Margaret's domain at the boarding house, now became the center of family life in ways she hadn't anticipated. While Thomas managed the business concerns and Emma did her lessons in the parlor, Margaret was the one who ensured the house remained functioning. But instead of invisibility, this work was now surrounded by recognition and gratitude. "You're keeping us alive," Thomas said, one particularly cold morning in January, watching Margaret prepare the stove to maintain heat through the night. "Not just alive, warm, safe, functioning. Do you understand how valuable that is?" Margaret had never quite internalized that her work could be valuable, simply because it served people who valued her. At the boarding house, her labor had been transactional. She worked. Mrs. Hartwell paid her. Nothing more. Here, the same tasks carried different weight because they were done for people who acknowledged them, who expressed gratitude, who made clear that her contributions mattered. The change had subtle effects. Margaret found herself standing differently. Her shoulders, which had spent years hunched in a posture of apologetic invisibility, began to straighten. Her voice, which had rarely risen above a whisper in public, grew more confident. She began to take up space in conversations, to offer opinions that weren't immediately preceded by apologies or qualifications. It was Emma who first vocalized what was happening. "You're different now," Emma said one afternoon in February, as they worked together in the kitchen preparing supper. Margaret was teaching the 7-year-old to make pie crust, showing her how the butter needed to be cold, how the water should be minimal, how the dough should come together like a miracle if you treated it right. "Different how?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. "You smile more," Emma said, concentrating on the dough beneath her small hands. "And you don't say sorry for things you didn't do wrong. And you sit at the table with Daddy at dinner like you belong there, not like you're waiting to be excused." Margaret set down her knife and looked at the child. "Do you like me better this way?" "I like you the same always," Emma said with the absolute certainty of childhood. "But I like that you're happy now. Daddy says happy looks good on you." The conversation stayed with Margaret long after Emma had gone to bed. She'd never thought of happiness as something visible, something that could be observed and commented upon. She'd thought of it as an internal state, if she'd thought of it at all. But Emma was right. She was different. The transformation wasn't just internal. It was external circumstances that forced the next shift in understanding. In early March, Thomas's business partner arrived at the house with news that required urgent discussion. Margaret was in the kitchen when she heard the voices rise, not in anger, but in the kind of urgent intensity that suggested serious complications. She continued her work, respecting the privacy of business concerns, but her attention was divided. Later that evening, after Emma was asleep, Thomas found Margaret in the kitchen, cleaning up from supper. His expression was troubled in a way she'd learned to recognize. "We have a problem," he said without preamble, sitting heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. "The business is facing some challenges. A major client has decided to move their contracts elsewhere. We're going to need to reduce expenses significantly, or we'll face financial difficulties." Margaret's stomach clenched. Financial difficulty meant instability. Instability meant the possibility of losing this house, this life, this version of herself that she'd only just begun to inhabit. "How serious?" she asked, sitting across from him. "Serious enough that we need to make difficult decisions," Thomas said. "I'm considering whether we should let Ruth go, reduce the household staff." "No," Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness of her response. "Not Ruth. She has family depending on her wages. There must be another way." Thomas looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "There might be," he said slowly, "but it would require difficult conversations and difficult choices." "What kind of choices?" Margaret pressed. "The kind where I'd need to ask you to take on more responsibility," Thomas said. "Where I'd need to ask you to work harder, to do things you've already been doing plus additional tasks without additional compensation, for an indefinite period." "I won't ask that of you unless you truly want to offer it," Margaret considered. The old Margaret, the one from the boarding house, would have simply agreed. would have accepted additional work without question, grateful for the opportunity to prove her worth through increased labor. But the Margaret who'd learned to see herself through Thomas's eyes, who'd stood publicly as his wife and been defended for it, understood that this was different. "Tell me exactly what you need," she said, "and then I'll tell you what I'm willing to do." What emerged was a plan that required Margaret to essentially run the household with minimal outside help. Ruth would come only once a week instead of 3 times. Margaret would manage all the cooking, all the laundry, all the mending, all the cleaning. It was, by any objective measure, a significant increase in labor, but it was also a position of significant trust. Thomas was essentially asking Margaret to be the architect of the household's functioning, not just an executioner of tasks others had designed. "I can do this," Margaret said, "but I need something in return." Thomas looked, startled. "What?" "I need you to stop apologizing for asking. I need you to understand that I'm not sacrificing anything. I'm contributing to something we're building together." "There's a difference," Thomas smiled. Sad but genuine. "You've changed so much since you arrived here." "So have you," Margaret replied. "You've learned to accept help. You've learned to see someone who doesn't fit society's standards and recognize her value anyway." That took courage. The following months were the most physically demanding of Margaret's life. She woke before dawn and worked until well after dark. She cleaned and cooked and mended and managed the household with the precision of someone who'd been trained in service, but was now applying that training to her own home rather than someone else's. What made it tolerable, what made it actually sustainable, was that Thomas noticed. He noticed the ways she reorganized the pantry for efficiency. He noticed when she figured out how to stretch ingredients further without sacrificing nutritional value. He noticed that she was tired and ensured she had rest days. He noticed that she was contributing not just labor, but innovation, strategy, intelligence. "You're running this household like a general runs an army," he observed one evening in April, watching her organize her supplies for the coming week. "With precision and care and tactical brilliance." "I learned from necessity," Margaret said. "When you have very little, waste becomes unacceptable." "It's more than that," Thomas countered. "You're approaching this work with the same mind you'd approach if you were managing a business. You've taken something that could be drudgery and transformed it into something more." By summer, the business had begun to recover. Thomas's partner had secured new contracts. The immediate financial crisis had passed. Thomas presented Margaret with an envelope one evening in early July, after Emma was asleep. "What is this?" Margaret asked. "Your wages," Thomas said simply, "for the work you did over these past months, for the labor and the strategy and the innovation you contributed to keeping this household functioning." Margaret opened the envelope and felt her breath catch. The amount was substantial, more money than she'd earned at the boarding house in 6 months. "I can't accept this," she said immediately. "I'm your wife. Wives don't get paid. Wives deserve to have economic independence," Thomas interrupted. "Wives deserve to know that their work is valued in concrete terms, not just in words. I want you to have money that belongs to you alone, money you can spend or save as you see fit. Money that proves you're not dependent on my goodwill to survive." Margaret understood what he was offering. Not just compensation, though that mattered, but autonomy, the ability to support herself. Protection against the kind of vulnerability that could trap a woman in an unsuitable situation. "What if I leave?" she asked quietly, testing the offer's sincerity. "Then you leave," Thomas said simply, "with money of your own, able to make real choices about your future. I'd be devastated, obviously, but I'd rather lose you knowing you had the freedom to choose to stay with me than keep you through financial necessity." Margaret tucked the money away carefully, understanding that the gesture was almost more important than the amount. This was what real partnership looked like, the willingness to offer your spouse escape routes, the confidence that they would choose to stay because they wanted to, not because they had to. The business continued to improve. By autumn, Thomas was able to expand his household staff again. Ruth returned to her full schedule. Other workers were hired for specific tasks. Margaret's workload decreased, but her authority increased. She was no longer just executing tasks. She was directing them, making decisions about what needed to be done and how best to accomplish it. With her increased leisure time, Margaret began to cultivate interests beyond the household. She started a small garden plot dedicated to medicinal herbs. She joined a women's reading circle in town, something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. She began to volunteer at the local school, helping children with reading and arithmetic. The women in the reading circle were initially wary. Margaret could see it in the way they greeted her, in the careful distance they maintained. But over time, something shifted. Margaret's observations about the books they read were intelligent and thoughtful. Her presence was consistent and genuine. And slowly, grudgingly, the women began to see her not as the woman who'd trapped the widower, but as a genuine person with her own thoughts and contributions to offer. One evening in October, nearly a year after she'd arrived in Montpelier, Margaret was called upon to give her opinion about a novel the group was reading. The book dealt with a woman who'd been excluded from society and the ways she'd learned to find value in herself despite the world's rejection. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that the book is suggesting something radical. It's suggesting that a woman's worth doesn't depend on how she's perceived or accepted by society. Her worth is intrinsic, inherent, unchanging, regardless of external circumstances." One of the women, Mrs. Catherine Moreau, who'd been among the most skeptical about Margaret initially, leaned forward with interest. "Do you believe that? That worth is intrinsic?" Margaret considered the question seriously. A year ago, she would have said no. A year ago, she'd believed her worth was measured in utility, in how much she could accomplish, in how invisible she could make herself. "I do now," Margaret said. "I didn't always. But I've learned that the times I've felt most worthless were the times I allowed other people's judgments to matter more than my own assessment of myself." Mrs. Moreau nodded, thoughtfully. "That's very wise, and I suspect you've had to learn that lesson rather personally." It wasn't an apology, exactly, but it was acknowledgement, recognition, a small crack opening in the wall of judgment that had surrounded Margaret since her arrival. That evening, as Margaret walked home from the reading circle, she found herself thinking about the woman she'd been invisible, apologetic, convinced that survival meant making herself as small as possible. That woman had been protecting herself, had been trying to avoid the kind of pain that came with visibility and vulnerability. But she'd also been suffocating. The woman, she was now confident, seen, valued. This woman was vulnerable in different ways. She could be hurt, she could lose things, but she could also experience joy, could build something real, could matter to people and have them matter to her in return. Thomas was waiting on the porch when she arrived home, Emma already asleep inside. He pulled Margaret close as she climbed the steps, and she breathed in the scent of him, the reality of him, the fact that this was genuinely her life now. "How was the reading circle?" he asked. "Good," Margaret said. "Mrs. Moreau asked me what I believed about self-worth." "What did you tell her?" "That I used to believe my value came from what I could do for others," Margaret said. "But I've learned it comes from knowing who I am, regardless of anyone's approval." Thomas smiled against her hair. "That's the most honest thing I've ever heard you say. I'm proud of you." Margaret leaned back to look at him. "For what? For reading a book? For becoming yourself?" he said. "For learning to take up space, for being brave enough to accept that you deserve good things." As they stood together on the porch, watching the stars emerge above Montpelier, Margaret understood that this was what transformation actually looked like. Not a sudden shift from one complete version of herself to another, but a gradual learning, a careful building, a slow reclamation of space and voice and value. She'd arrived at this house as an invisible servant. She was becoming something else entirely. Not a servant anymore, though she still knew how to serve. Not invisible, though she could still move quietly when needed. But a woman, a wife, a mother, a partner. A person finally and completely seen. Winter arrived early in Vermont that year, bringing with it an intensity that caught everyone unprepared. By mid-November, snow had accumulated to depths that made travel difficult, and the temperature dropped so low that exposed skin would freeze within minutes. The Ashford house, well-maintained and carefully heated, became a sanctuary against the elements. It was during this imposed isolation that Margaret received a letter. She was sorting through the mail one afternoon in early December when she recognized the handwriting on one of the envelopes, precise, educated, unmistakably familiar. Her maiden name was written there. Margaret Chen. Not Mrs. Ashford. Not the woman she'd become, but the woman she'd been. The envelope was postmarked from Burlington, and her heart began to race even before she opened it. Inside was a letter from Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the proprietor of the boarding house where Margaret had worked for 7 years. The letter was brief and businesslike, but its contents sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the winter weather. "My dear Miss Chen," it began, using her maiden name despite knowing she was married. "I write to you regarding a delicate matter. A woman has appeared in Burlington, claiming to be interested in purchasing the boarding house. However, she is asking questions about my former employees, specifically about you. She seems particularly interested in your whereabouts and your current circumstances. When I refused to provide information, she became quite insistent. I thought you should be warned that someone is actively seeking you." The letter contained no signature, just the block initials E.H. At the bottom, Margaret stood in the kitchen holding the letter, her hands trembling slightly. She couldn't imagine who would be looking for her, couldn't think of any reason someone would track her down after she'd left the boarding house. She'd made no enemies there, had kept no connections that would motivate someone to pursue her across the state. But beneath the confusion was a deeper fear, the kind of primal alarm that her body recognized, even if her mind couldn't articulate the threat. Thomas found her there an hour later, still holding the letter, staring at it as if it might reveal something if she looked long enough. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, reading the distress on her face the way he'd learned to do. Margaret handed him the letter without speaking. He read it twice, his expression growing more serious with each word. When he finished, he looked at her carefully. "Do you have any idea who this woman might be?" he asked. "None," Margaret said. "I left no forwarding address. I had no friends from before the boarding house who would know where I went. I can't imagine." The knock on the door interrupted her. It was unusual visitors rarely attempted the journey in this weather, and they always announced themselves first. Thomas and Margaret exchanged a glance, and Thomas wheeled himself toward the parlor where Emma was doing her lessons. "Stay here," he instructed Margaret, his voice taking on a tone she'd never heard from him before, something protective, cautious. Margaret heard the door open, heard Thomas's greeting, heard a woman's voice respond. Something in that voice made Margaret's skin prickle with recognition, though she couldn't quite place it. She moved toward the parlor doorway, not quite hiding but not fully revealing herself either. That's when she saw her. The woman was perhaps in her early 50s, expensively dressed, her bearing suggesting someone accustomed to authority and deference. Her face was familiar in the way that certain nightmares are familiar, not from recent experience, but from the deep past, from memories Margaret had thought safely buried. It was Margaret's father's sister, Aunt Patricia. Margaret's parents had died more than a decade ago. Aunt Patricia had made it clear after their deaths that she wanted nothing to do with Margaret, that the girl represented an unwelcome complication in a family that valued order and appearances above all else. They hadn't spoken in more than 15 years. "I'm looking for my niece," Aunt Patricia was saying, water dripping from her coat onto the Ashford's entryway floor. "Margaret Chen. I understand she's working in this household. I've come to collect her." "Collect her?" Thomas repeated, his voice taking on that same protective quality. "I'm afraid I don't understand. Margaret is not a possession to be collected. She's my wife." Aunt Patricia's face shifted, something like, shock crossing her features before being quickly controlled. His wife? That's impossible. Margaret is… well, she's Margaret. No man of standing would marry someone like my wife. Thomas interrupted coolly. Someone intelligent, capable, valuable? I suggest you reconsider your assumptions, madam. I'm Thomas Ashford, and Margaret is exactly where she wants to be. Margaret stepped forward then, revealing herself. Hello, Aunt Patricia. For a moment, the older woman simply stared, as if unable to reconcile the Margaret she remembered small, apologetic, trying to take up as little space as possible with the woman standing before her now. Margaret had straightened her posture since coming to Montpelier. She'd gained weight, not enough to be obvious, but enough to fill out her frame in a way that suggested health rather than deprivation. She wore a dress she'd made herself, well-fitted and flattering. Her hair, which she'd kept pinned up for years, was arranged in a cairn style that framed her face. "You look different," Aunt Patricia said finally, her tone suggesting she couldn't decide whether this was an improvement or deterioration. "I am different," Margaret replied calmly. "I'm happy. I have a family. I have a life I'm building with my husband and stepdaughter." "What brings you here, Aunt Patricia?" "Your mother's will," Aunt Patricia said abruptly. "The estate was finally settled. There's a small inheritance, about $200, that was meant to go to you. I've been trying to locate you for months. When I finally found you at that boarding house, they told me you'd left. I've been tracking you ever since." Margaret felt Thomas stiffen slightly beside her. $200 was a significant amount of money, more than enough to provide real security. "I see," Margaret said slowly. "And how exactly does one track someone across Vermont in winter?" "With difficulty and at considerable expense," Aunt Patricia admitted. "But family is family, regardless of circumstances. Your mother would have wanted you to have your inheritance." There was something performative about this sudden concern for family obligation, something that didn't quite align with Aunt Patricia's previous abandonment. Margaret studied her aunt's face, looking for the real motivation beneath the stated one. "How is the rest of the family?" Margaret asked, watching for reactions. "Well enough," Aunt Patricia said carefully. "Your cousin Robert married a judge's daughter last year. Quite an advantageous match. And the rest? All pursuing respectable lives, maintaining respectable positions in respectable society," Aunt Patricia replied, and Margaret caught it then. The subtle emphasis, the implication that respectability was threatened by something. "Why don't we discuss this in the parlor?" Thomas said, his tone making it clear this was not a request. "You're dripping water on my floor, and I suspect this conversation will take some time." Once they were settled in the parlor, Aunt Patricia taking the most comfortable chair, despite not being invited to do so, the real purpose of her visit began to emerge. "I'll be direct," Aunt Patricia said. "The family has faced some complications. Robert's wife's family is quite socially prominent, and they've begun making inquiries about all branches of the family. They're quite interested in knowing about everyone's circumstances, everyone's situations. And when I was forced to admit that you exist, and that I had no information about your life, well, it raised questions." "Questions about what?" Margaret asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "About whether there might be any family scandal," Aunt Patricia said bluntly. "Any embarrassment that might complicate Robert's position or the family's standing. You disappeared years ago. You worked as a servant. And now you're apparently married to a man I've never heard of in a town I've never visited. The combination raises certain concerns." Margaret felt Thomas take her hand. His grip was steady, supportive, reminding her that whatever was about to happen, she wasn't facing it alone. "The family is worried that I might be an embarrassment," Margaret said flatly. "That my existence, my circumstances, might somehow reflect poorly on Robert's marriage prospects or family connections." "In a word, yes," Aunt Patricia said. "So I'm prepared to offer you a solution. We'll provide you with the inheritance, of course. And we'll also provide an additional sum, let's say another $1,000. If you're willing to sign a document acknowledging that you've removed yourself from the family, that you're no longer associated with us in any way, and that you will make no claims on family connections or reputation going forward." Thomas stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward with force. "You're attempting to bribe my wife to pretend she doesn't exist? To erase herself from her own family history? I'm attempting to provide her with financial security while protecting my family from unnecessary complications," Aunt Patricia said coolly. "It's a reasonable arrangement from where I sit." "It's insulting from where I sit," Thomas replied, his voice cold in a way Margaret had never heard from him before. "Margaret, you don't need to answer this. You don't owe this woman anything." But Margaret was thinking. The inheritance itself was genuinely hers. It came from her mother, and she had every right to it. The additional $1,000 represented security, options, a layer of protection that any woman in her position should value. But it came with a price that Thomas seemed to understand immediately, the price of self-erasure. "Tell me something," Margaret said to her aunt. "If I sign this document, if I agree to remove myself from the family, what happens when Robert's wife's family asks about me? What will you tell them?" "We'll tell them you died," Aunt Patricia said without hesitation. "It's simpler that way. A tragic accident years ago. Nothing worth dwelling on." Margaret felt the full weight of the offer then. They didn't just want her to disappear from their lives. They wanted her to actually disappear, to become retroactively erased, to never have existed in any way that could threaten their social standing. She thought about the boarding house, about 7 years of invisibility. She thought about Mrs. Hartwell looking through her rather than at her. She thought about the woman she'd been, the one who'd learned to accept erasure as the price of survival. "No," Margaret said clearly. "I won't sign your document. I won't pretend I don't exist. I won't erase myself to make your family more comfortable." "Margaret," Aunt Patricia said, her tone shifting to something almost pleading. "Be reasonable. This is an opportunity. Financial security, a clean break." "At the cost of pretending I'm dead?" Margaret interrupted. "At the cost of becoming a ghost? No, absolutely not." "Then you won't receive the additional 1,000, Aunt Patricia said coldly. "And I'm afraid the family will have to make its own decisions about how to address your existence when the questions become more pressing." "Then make those decisions," Margaret replied. "Tell them I exist. Tell them I married a good man who values me. Tell them I'm building a life here that has nothing to do with their social standing. And if that embarrasses them, well, perhaps that's information they need to hear." Aunt Patricia stood, her face tight with displeasure. "You're making a mistake." "No," Margaret said quietly. "For the first time in my life, I'm making choices that are entirely my own, based on what I value, not on what other people need from me. I won't sign your document. I won't erase myself. And I would appreciate it if you would leave my home." Thomas wheeled himself toward the door, making it clear that this wasn't a suggestion. Aunt Patricia gathered her things, but before she left, she paused. "Your mother would be disappointed in you," she said, her tone cutting. "My mother," Margaret replied, "died believing that my value came from my capability and my character. She would be proud of me for refusing to sell either of those things. Now please go." After Aunt Patricia left, Margaret stood alone in the parlor for a long moment. Thomas appeared in the doorway but didn't speak, understanding that she needed space to process what had just happened. "I turned down the inheritance," Margaret said finally. "Not just the additional 1,000, but all of it, the original 200 as well. I don't want money that comes with conditions like that. I don't want to be obligated to people who see me as a problem to be managed." Thomas wheeled closer. "Are you sure? $200 is significant." "I'm sure," Margaret said. "I'm sure because accepting it would mean I never fully escape the boarding house. I'd still be working for approval. Still. Trying to prove myself to people who will never value me for who I am. I'm done with that. I don't need their money. I have what I need right here." "You don't know what might happen in the future," Thomas said gently. "You don't know if you might regret." "I won't," Margaret interrupted. Because whatever future I build, I want it to be built on my own terms, not on terms dictated by people who wanted me to disappear. I'm not disappearing anymore, Thomas. Not for anyone. Thomas pulled her close, and Margaret realized she was shaking not from fear, but from the force of her own conviction. She'd just walked away from financial security, from the possibility of family reconciliation, from the inheritance that should have been hers. But in doing so, she'd also walked away from the last chains that bound her to the person she'd been. She'd chosen herself. She'd chosen this life, this man, this family, completely and without reservation. "Emma," Thomas called, and within moments their daughter appeared in the doorway. "Come here. I want to tell you a story about your mother and the terrible choices brave people sometimes have to make." As Emma climbed into Margaret's lap and Thomas began to explain what had happened, Margaret understood that this too was transformation, not the kind that happened in quiet moments, but the kind that required standing firm in the face of pressure, of choosing to be fully present and visible, of refusing to make herself small for anyone's comfort but her own. The inheritance she'd refused suddenly seemed like the least valuable thing she could have accepted. What she'd kept instead, her integrity, her voice, her right to exist without apology, was worth infinitely more than any amount of money. Spring came to Montpelier with the same gentle insistence that it had the previous year, but Margaret experienced it differently this time. She knew now what the melting snow meant, not just the change of seasons, but the beginning of new growth, the acknowledgement that what seemed frozen could thaw, that what appeared dead could come alive again. The garden she'd planted the year before had survived the winter, and new shoots were already beginning to emerge from soil that had seemed lifeless only weeks before. It was on a Saturday in late April, nearly 2 years after Margaret had first arrived at the Ashford house, that she received a visitor who forced her to confront how far she'd travelled from the woman she'd been. Ruth was helping in the garden when the carriage arrived. Margaret was inside, preparing lunch, having learned to pace her work so that the kitchen wouldn't be overwhelming when Emma came home from school. She heard the carriage wheels on the drive and the distinctive sound of an unfamiliar voice greeting Ruth. By instinct born of years of invisibility, Margaret moved to the window rather than to the door. Old habits, she'd learned, died slowly, even when you were actively trying to kill them. The woman who emerged from the carriage was young, probably in her late 20s, and was dressed in the practical clothing of someone accustomed to working rather than being worked for. There was something vaguely familiar about her, though Margaret couldn't place it immediately. The woman spoke briefly with Ruth, who pointed toward the house, and then she began walking up the path. The knock came moments later. Margaret set down her knife and went to answer it, her mind already cycling through possibilities. A messenger from town? Someone seeking Thomas for business purposes? A representative from one of the charitable organizations Margaret had become involved with? She opened the door to find herself face to face with a young woman whose eyes widened with recognition. "You're her," the woman said. "You're Margaret Chen Ashford." "I wasn't sure the descriptions I received weren't entirely clear, but now that I see you, I'm certain." "I'm sorry," Margaret said carefully. "Do I know you?" "No," the woman replied, "but I know of you, or rather, I know your story. I'm Rebecca Hartwell, Eleanor Hartwell's niece. I run a boarding house in Rutland now, and my aunt has been telling me about the remarkable woman who worked for her, who married a widower and completely transformed her life." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. The name Hartwell brought back a flood of memories. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell's imperious voice, the constant awareness of being judged and found wanting, the 7 years of invisibility that had preceded her arrival in this house. "Your aunt mentioned me?" Margaret asked, surprised. "Extensively," Rebecca said with a slight smile. "Particularly over the past year, she seems to view your marriage with Mr. Ashford as some sort of miracle or scandal. She's genuinely unclear which. But she also speaks about you with a respect I wasn't entirely expecting from someone of her generation and station." "Please, come in," Margaret said, stepping. Aside, you've travelled far in this weather. You must be tired. Over tea in the parlour, Rebecca explained her purpose. She had taken over the management of a boarding house in Rutland, one that catered to working people rather than the upper classes. She was attempting to create an environment that was different from her aunt's establishment, one that valued the dignity and humanity of its workers alongside efficiency and respectability. "I'm struggling with the kitchen," Rebecca admitted. "The woman I hired is adequate but not inspired. The meals are functional but joyless. And my guests comment regularly about the absence of genuine care in the preparation. When my aunt mentioned your name, when she described what you'd accomplished here, I began to wonder if perhaps you might know someone who could help. A former colleague, perhaps, or someone with your philosophy about food and service." Margaret listened carefully, beginning to understand the real purpose of the visit. Rebecca wasn't simply seeking advice. She was making an offer, though she was circling around it carefully, probably uncertain how to approach a woman who'd transcended the servant class. "What exactly are you looking for in a cook?" Margaret asked directly. "Someone who understands that feeding people is an act of care," Rebecca said. "Someone who sees the value in what they do. Someone who brings meaning to the work rather than just completing tasks." "I know someone," Margaret said slowly. "She works at a boarding house in Burlington, actually. Her name is Catherine. She was there when I was. And she had just the qualities you're describing, though I'm not sure she realized it herself. She was always the one who'd add extra vegetables to the stew, who'd bake small treats for the guests, who seemed to genuinely care about whether people were satisfied." Rebecca leaned forward with interest. "Is she available? Would she be interested?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted, "but I could find out. I could write to her, explain the opportunity. If she's still at the boarding house, she might be ready for a change." What emerged from the conversation was a relationship that would span the following years. Rebecca became a regular visitor to the Ashford house, arriving quarterly to discuss not just business concerns but life, philosophy, the nature of growth and change. And Margaret, in turn, became a consultant of sorts, not in an official capacity, but through conversation and correspondence. She began to share the insights she'd gained about creating spaces where people felt valued and where work carried dignity. Catherine did take the position at Rebecca's boarding house, and within a year, the establishment had gained a reputation for meals that were not just adequate, but genuinely nourishing. Other young women who worked in difficult circumstances began asking about opportunities at the Rutland house, drawn by the reputation that it was a place where workers were treated as humans rather than interchangeable parts. But the real transformation came when Rebecca proposed something more formal. "I want to create a school," Rebecca said one afternoon in October, as she and Margaret sat in what had become their customary spot in the Ashford parlour. "A school specifically for young women who work in domestic service. I want to teach them not just the technical skills of their trades, but also their own value. I want them to understand that service is honourable, but it doesn't have to mean invisibility." "That's revolutionary," Margaret said, understanding immediately what Rebecca was proposing. "Is it?" Rebecca replied. "Or is it simply obvious? You figured it out for yourself. You became visible through sheer force of will and the fortunate circumstance of meeting someone willing to see you. Not everyone has that luxury. I want to create a structure that helps other women figure it out too." "You want me to help," Margaret said. "It wasn't a question. I want you to be the core of it," Rebecca corrected. "You're the one who understands both worlds, the world of invisible service and the world of being valued and seen. You could teach in a way that textbooks never could." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. She had a family now, responsibilities, a life that felt complete and full. Adding external work seemed unnecessary, seemed like it might complicate what she'd carefully built. But she thought about Catherine, still working in service, still probably feeling the weight of invisibility that Margaret had felt. She thought about all the other Margarets scattered across Vermont and beyond, women who'd learned to make themselves small, who'd internalized the message that their value came only from their utility. "I'll help," Margaret said, "but I need conditions." Rebecca smiled, understanding that Margaret was learning to negotiate from a position of strength rather than desperation. "What conditions?" "I won't leave my family," Margaret said. "I won't take a position that requires me to abandon my responsibilities here. But I could teach certain days. Perhaps we could establish the school here in Montpelier initially, and I could work with Rebecca to help her establish the curriculum and train the initial instructors." "That's entirely reasonable," Rebecca agreed. "And honestly, having the school here, in a house like this one, with a family like yours, as an example of what's possible that's actually better than having it in Rutland. It makes the lessons more immediate, more real." Thomas was enthusiastic when Margaret told him about the proposal. Emma, now 9 years old, was even more enthusiastic, immediately declaring that she would help teach. "You can teach them about numbers," Margaret told her daughter, "about the mathematics of household management, about how to calculate efficiently so that nothing is wasted." What began as an informal arrangement in the Ashford home gradually became something more structured. Rebecca arranged funding through contacts she had in the business community. A small building adjacent to the Ashford house was renovated to serve as a classroom. Young women from across the region, some recommended by employers, some seeking the opportunity themselves, began to attend. The curriculum Margaret and Rebecca developed was unlike anything available elsewhere. It taught the technical skills that domestic workers needed: cooking, cleaning, laundry, household management. But it also taught something far more revolutionary: the understanding that these skills had value independent of the market price placed on them, and that a woman's worth was not determined by how much she was willing to accept for her labor. Margaret taught many of the classes herself, but more importantly, she modeled an alternative way of being. Her students could see that a woman could wear an apron and understand advanced cooking techniques. They could see that service work didn't require self-erasure. They could see that intelligence and capability and personal dignity weren't luxuries available only to the wealthy. They were fundamental human characteristics. One afternoon, about 6 months into the school's operation, a young woman named Sarah approached Margaret after class. Sarah was probably 17, thin in the way that suggested she'd known want, her eyes carrying the particular caution of someone who'd learned early not to expect kindness. "I wanted to thank you," Sarah said quietly, "for what you taught today about valuing your own work. I've been thinking about leaving my position because my employer treats me like I'm invisible. But I thought that was just how things were. I didn't realize I had a choice." Margaret set down the materials she'd been organizing and gave Sarah her full attention. "You do have a choice. It might not be an easy choice, and it might not be obvious what the alternative is, but you always have the fundamental choice about how much of yourself you're willing to give to a situation." "Do you think I should leave?" Sarah asked. "I think you should understand what you're worth first," Margaret replied, "and then make a decision based on that knowledge rather than based on what you've been taught to expect." "Those are two very different things." Sarah nodded slowly, processing this. "Did you learn that here, or did you have to learn it somewhere else first?" Margaret considered the question. "I learned it slowly, and I learned it from someone who was willing to see me clearly. That person became my husband. But I think the fundamental lesson that you have inherent value, regardless of how others perceive you, I think that's something you could learn here. That's what Rebecca and I are trying to teach." By the time Emma turned 12, the school had expanded beyond what Margaret and Rebecca had initially imagined. Young women were arriving from other states, drawn by the reputation of the Prevalence program. Thomas had reluctantly agreed to allow the use of additional outbuildings to expand the facilities. The school had become in many ways an extension of Margaret's life, in the same way that the household had. It was on Emma's 12th birthday that Thomas proposed something that would have seemed impossible a few years before. The family was gathered in the garden. Emma, Margaret, Thomas, Ruth, and several of the school's instructors who'd become close friends. They were celebrating with a picnic, something that had become tradition on Emma's birthday. As the sun began to set, Thomas called for quiet. "I have an announcement," he said, his tone suggesting something significant. "Margaret, I've been offered a position in the state education department. It's consultative work, helping develop standards for schools across Vermont." "I turned it down." Margaret looked at him, confused. "Why would you turn down an opportunity like that?" "Because it would have required us to move to Montpelier's capital city," Thomas explained. "It would have separated us from this community, from the work you and Rebecca have built, from the home we've created. And I realized that the advancement I've pursued my entire life doesn't matter as much as the life I've actually built here. So I declined." "Thomas, you shouldn't have done that without discussing it with me," Margaret said, but her tone wasn't angry, it was thoughtful. "I would have considered the possibility seriously." "I know you would have," Thomas replied, "which is why I want to tell you this. I'm proposing that we make the school a permanent institution, that we formalize it, that we establish it as a registered educational enterprise. And I want you to be not just the lead instructor, but the director. Not because you need my permission or support, but because I want to publicly acknowledge your role in creating something genuinely transformative." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or overwhelm. They were tears of recognition, of the full circle moment where the invisible servant had become the visible architect of something meaningful. "I need to think about that," she said honestly. "It's a significant responsibility." "It is," Thomas agreed, "but you're ready for it. You've been ready for years. You're just finally believing it." Emma, not fully understanding all the implications but sensing that something important had occurred, squeezed Margaret's hand. "Will you do it, Mother? Will you make the school official?" Margaret looked at her stepdaughter, no longer stepdaughter in her heart, simply daughter, and at Thomas, and at Ruth, and at the other women who'd gathered around them. She thought about the boarding house in Burlington, about Mrs. Hartwell's indifferent gaze. She thought about the woman she'd been, convinced that invisibility was the price of survival. "Yes," she said, "yes, I'll do it, but on one condition." "What?" Thomas asked. "That we never forget why this school exists," Margaret said. "That we never become complacent about the value of the women who pass through it. That we continue to teach not just skills, but the fundamental truth that visibility, voice, and value are rights, not privileges." Over the following year, the school became officially incorporated. Margaret was named director. Rebecca was named associate director and curriculum developer. The program expanded to include not just domestic service training, but also basic business education, accounting, management principles, negotiation skills. Young women began leaving the school not just as better servants, but as entrepreneurs who could open their own establishments or start their own businesses if they chose to. The school's success began to draw attention beyond Vermont. Educators from other states wanted to understand Margaret's approach. Publications wrote articles about the revolutionary school run by a former servant who'd transformed her own life and was now transforming the lives of others. Margaret gave interviews, though she was always uncomfortable with the attention. But she understood that visibility had value, that telling her story could help other women understand that transformation was possible. "People always want to make me into something I'm not," Margaret said in one interview with a journalist from Boston. "They want me to be either a cautionary tale or a miracle story. But I'm neither. I'm simply a woman who was fortunate enough to be seen by someone, who was brave enough to accept being seen, and who is now trying to help other women understand that they don't need to wait for that external validation. They can see themselves clearly right now." On a quiet evening in late spring, now nearly 5 years after Margaret had arrived in Montpelier, she sat in the garden with Thomas. Emma was away at school. She'd insisted on attending an academic institution rather than being educated at home. determined to prove that she could succeed in the wider world. Ruth was managing the evening preparation in the kitchen. The world around them had changed significantly, but their shared corner of it remained familiar, grounded, safe. "I was thinking about something," Thomas said, taking Margaret's hand in the way that had become comfortable and familiar. "About the woman who arrived at the boarding house 2 years before we met. The one who existed in the margins, invisible, convinced that survival meant not being noticed." "I remember her," Margaret said softly. "I'm trying to understand how that woman became this woman," Thomas continued, gesturing at the garden around them, at the school building in the distance, at the life they'd built together. What was the moment when everything changed? Margaret considered the question carefully. "I don't think there was one moment," she said finally. "It was incremental. It was you treating me like I mattered. It was Emma needing me and me, realizing that she was right to. It was standing up for myself when people tried to diminish me. It was learning to expect more from life than just survival. But most of all, it was deciding that I was worth being visible. That took courage. Not the dramatic kind that shows up in stories, but the quiet courage of showing up as yourself when you've spent your whole life hiding. You were always worth being visible," Thomas said. "You just needed someone to show you that it was safe." "Perhaps," Margaret agreed, "but I also needed to choose it for myself. I needed to reach the point where I understood that invisibility, for all its apparent safety, was actually a form of death. That being seen, being known, being valued, those things were worth the risk of vulnerability." As the sun set over Montpelier, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Margaret reflected on the remarkable trajectory of her life. She'd arrived at the boarding house 7 years ago as a woman convinced that her value came from her utility. She'd left it as a woman beginning to understand that her value was inherent. The school, the marriage, the family, these were all external confirmations of what she'd had to learn internally, that she was worthy of being seen, that her voice mattered, that her presence in the world wasn't a complication but a contribution. "Thank you," Margaret said to Thomas. "For what?" he asked. "For looking," Margaret replied simply, "for looking at me and seeing a person instead of a problem to be solved, for giving me permission to be visible, for building this life with me." Thomas smiled, the same smile she'd learned to recognize as genuine warmth rather than polite distance. "Thank you for having the courage to accept being seen. Thank you for choosing to stay. Thank you for becoming who you were always meant to be." As night fell over the house, the school, the garden, the life they'd carefully constructed together, Margaret understood that this was the real transformation, not the external changes, though those mattered, but the internal shift from believing she should be invisible to understanding that visibility was her birthright. She'd been told for so long that her size, her age, her circumstances made her unworthy of love, attention, value. She'd internalized those messages so completely that she'd built her entire identity around not bothering anyone, around being useful without being demanding, around existing in the margins. But Thomas had looked at her and seen something different. Emma had needed her and made her feel essential. The school had given her a platform to help other women understand what she'd had to learn the hard way, that a woman's worth doesn't depend on her appearance, her circumstances, or anyone else's validation. It comes from within. As Margaret looked out at the life she'd built, a life that would have seemed impossible to the invisible woman of the boarding house, she understood that this was the greatest reclamation of all, not just survival, but thriving. Not just acceptance, but genuine belonging. She had been told that no one loves a larger girl. She had proven that lie. She had found love, partnership, purpose, and community. She had built a life where her presence mattered, where her voice was heard, where her value was recognized and celebrated. And in doing so, she'd created a legacy that extended far beyond herself. In the school she'd founded, in the young women she taught, in the lives she helped transform, Margaret's journey from invisibility to visibility continued to ripple outward, showing others that transformation was possible, that visibility was worth the vulnerability, that every person deserved to be seen. The story of the servant who married the widower had become something far greater, a blueprint for how to reclaim your life, how to demand visibility, how to transform desperation into purpose, and how to build a future worth living. And it had all begun with one woman saying yes to the possibility that she might be more than what the world had told her she was. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.